In the winter of 1887, in a farmhouse sitting at the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, a crew of men hired to renovate an old stone hearth stopped working around mid-morning and refused to go back inside. The foreman, a man named Elias Pruitt, filed a brief written account with the county clerk 3 days later. Not a complaint, not a legal notice, just a statement. He wanted something on record before the talk started, before the rumors spread too far in the wrong direction. The account described what the men had found behind the fireplace's back wall when they began removing the stones one by one. A passage, narrow enough that a grown man would have to turn sideways to enter, descending at a slight angle into the earth beneath the house. Pruitt's statement noted 2 things that made his men refuse to continue. First, when the passage had been sealed from the inside. Second, along the narrow corridor's left wall, at roughly chest height, someone had carved a series of marks, not letters, not numbers, that repeated at regular intervals, as though they were counting something. The county clerk stamped the document and placed it in a folder. The folder was mislaid sometime in the following decade. The farmhouse changed hands 4 more times before anyone thought to ask why the back wall of the fireplace had been rebuilt so poorly, and why the mortar used on that single section was 20 years newer than the rest. Before we continue with the story of the Harlan County farmhouse and the passage that was never supposed to be found, if you've never been here before, welcome to Liturgy of Fear, where we uncover the darkest and most unsettling corners of American history. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Hit the notification bell and tell us in the comments, what state or city are you listening from tonight? The truth about what lay beneath that farmhouse didn't emerge all at once. It came in pieces, the way most ugly things do. A document here, a name there, a detail that only made sense when you set it beside 3 other details that no one had thought to connect. What follows is the story of a house, a hidden passage, and the human decisions that made both necessary. Decisions that a family carried for decades in complete silence, for reasons that, once understood, reveal something deeply uncomfortable about the particular moment in American history when the passage was most actively used. Harlan County sits in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, pressed against the Virginia state line by a ridge of mountains that made it one of the most isolated pockets of the Appalachian interior for most of the 19th century. The Cumberland Mountains did not simply surround the county, they defined it. They shaped who could come in and who could leave, how quickly news traveled, and how long a secret could stay buried before the ground gave it up. To understand the farmhouse on Poor Fork, you first need to understand what Kentucky meant in the decades before the Civil War and in the years that followed it. The state occupied a position that was geographic before it was political. A border state, slave-holding but not seceded. Southern in its agricultural economy and in many of its social arrangements, but pressed against Ohio and Indiana to the north. Free states where the law worked differently. The Ohio River, which formed Kentucky's northern boundary, was more than a geographic feature. For tens of thousands of people, it was the most important line on any map. Crossing it meant one thing. Failing to cross it meant something else entirely. But eastern Kentucky, tucked in its mountains, was not the Ohio River. It was not the quick dash across open water to the opposite bank. It was 100 miles of ridgelines and creek valleys, of settlements that were days apart on horseback in good weather and impassable in bad, of communities where everyone knew everyone and a stranger's presence was noted and discussed. Moving through this landscape required assistance. It required people who knew which routes were watched and which were not, and which families could be trusted and which could not, which farms had root cellars deep enough to serve as shelter for a night, and which had neighbors too close to risk it. In the decades before the Civil War, one of those farms was the Cornett Place on Poor Fork. Harlan County in the 1840s was coal country in name only. The seams were there, running dark and fat beneath the ridges, but the infrastructure to extract them at scale had not yet arrived. What the county had in abundance was farmland carved from hollows and creek bottoms, a scattering of small communities with names tied to family lines: Clover Fork, Cranks Creek, Yockum Branch, and a population that had been there long enough to develop the particular insularity of people who have learned to solve their own problems quietly. There was a legal system, and there were courts and sheriffs and county records. But the law as it operated in the mountain hollows was not always the same law as it appeared in the statute books. And everyone understood this, and most people preferred it that way. The farmhouse itself was a log and stone construction of the kind common to the region. 2 main rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above reached by a ladder, a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the kitchen, and a large central fireplace built from fieldstone that served as the house's primary heat source through the brutal Appalachian winters. The winters in Harlan County in the mid-19th century were serious things. Not the kind of cold that inconveniences, but the kind that kills livestock and splits wood, left unattended on the porch, and drives the temperature inside an unheated room below freezing by midnight. The fireplace was not a decorative element. It was the heart of the house in the most literal sense, and everything in the interior of that building was arranged in relation to it. The farm had been established sometime in the early 1840s by a man named Absalom Cornett, who had come south from Letcher County with his wife, Margaret, and 2 younger brothers whose names appear in the deed records as co-signatories, but who vanished from the county's official record within 5 years of the property's establishment. There is no definitive explanation for the brothers' disappearance from the documentary record. They may have moved on to other counties. They may have died. Whatever happened to them, they do not reappear in Harlan County records after 1847, and neither Absalom nor Margaret ever explained their absence to anyone who committed the explanation to paper. Absalom Cornett was not, by the surviving accounts, a remarkable man. He paid his taxes without dispute. He attended the Baptist congregation at Clover Fork with enough regularity to be considered a member in good standing, not a zealot, but present, which in that community carried its own significance. He had a reputation among his neighbors as a careful farmer and a fair trader, someone you could deal with and not feel cheated afterward, which was the highest form of praise available in a community where most transactions were conducted on trust and handshakes. His word, people said, was the kind of word that stuck. His wife, Margaret, Omne Bray, came from a family that had been in Letcher County since before the Revolution, and she brought to the marriage a practicality that several contemporaries noted in letters and diaries of the period. She was described in one such letter, written by a neighboring woman named Celia Fugate to her sister in Virginia, as a woman who does not speak unless she has something worth saying, which makes her words count double. A separate account from the diary of a circuit-riding preacher who visited the county in the 1850s described her as a woman of evident intelligence who conducts herself with a reserve that might be mistaken for coldness by those who do not look carefully enough. She was not cold. The subsequent history of the Cornett farm makes this abundantly clear. She was careful. There is a significant difference, and it matters enormously to what follows. The couple had 3 children who survived to adulthood. A son named Hiram, born in 1844, and 2 daughters, Lavinia and Ruth, born in 1847 and 1851, respectively. By the time the Civil War came to Kentucky in earnest, and in Harlan County, it came hard. with the county's loyalties split down the middle in ways that persisted as a source of violence long after the official fighting stopped. Absalom Cornett was in his mid-50s, too old for active service, but not old enough to be exempt from the consequences of a war that treated geography as an affront and turned neighbors into enemies without much warning. Hiram, old enough to fight, did not fight. The record of why is unclear. There was a period of illness noted in a county medical ledger, a fever sometime in the winter of 1861, that seems to have kept him at the farm during the period when most young men of his age were making their decisions about which uniform to put on. By the time the fever passed, the county's military situation had become complicated enough that a young man with a farm to manage and elderly parents to look after could, with some difficulty, remain where he was. Whether the difficulty was genuine or manufactured is a question that the surviving record does not answer. What the record does answer, or begins to answer, is what was happening at the Cornett farm during the years when the war made the county dangerous. The first documented mention of anything unusual at the Cornett farmhouse appears in a letter written in October of 1863 by a Home Guard lieutenant named Josiah Hensley, who was responsible for monitoring movement along the Poor Fork corridor during a period of particularly intense guerrilla activity. Hensley's letter, addressed to his commanding officer in Barberville, was a routine patrol report of the kind that accumulates in military archives by the thousands. Dry, descriptive, written in the clipped style of a man who has learned to commit to paper only what he cannot avoid committing. But buried in the middle of the third paragraph is an observation that does not fit the routine character of the rest of the report. The patrol had passed within a quarter-mile of the Cornett property on a cold, overcast morning and had observed smoke rising from the chimney at an hour when the household should not yet have been awake, well before dawn. The letter specifies not the tentative gray of earliest morning, but the full dark of 2 or 3 in the morning, when even the most industrious farm household would not yet have started its fire for the day. The smoke was rising steadily, not as from a fire just lit, but with the settled density of a blaze that had been going for some time. This detail would be unremarkable on its own. People wake early in farming households, especially in cold weather, especially when livestock need attending. Fires are started for any number of reasons in the small hours, and a man patrolling a creek valley in October 1863 had larger concerns than his neighbors' sleep schedules. But Hensley's letter continues. 2 of his men, who had paused to observe the property from the tree line, reported hearing sounds from inside the house that they described as muffled, as though someone were moving heavy objects across a stone floor. The sounds lasted approximately 20 minutes and then stopped entirely, with a completeness that one of the soldiers apparently found more unsettling than the sounds themselves. The way a forest goes quiet when something is moving through it, and the quiet feels like information. When the household stirred at a normal hour shortly after dawn, nothing appeared out of order. Absalom Cornett came out to see to his livestock at the usual time. His son Hiram split wood near the barn with the methodical regularity of a man who has been splitting wood on the same farm since childhood. There was no indication in the household's daytime behavior that anything had occurred during the night. The fire in the hearth, visible through the window when the door was briefly opened, was burning at the modest level appropriate to a household beginning its morning, not the sustained high heat that weeks later Hensley would connect, in a private letter to his wife, with what he had seen rising from the chimney in the dark. Hensley noted the observation in his official letter, not because he thought it significant, but because he had been instructed to record anything that deviated from the expected pattern of daily life along his patrol route. The deviation was small. He filed it and moved on. What he did not know, and what would not become clear until decades later, was that the same observation, smoke before dawn, sounds of movement in the night, not the household resuming its ordinary routine as though nothing had interrupted it, was made on at least 6 separate occasions by at least 4 different people over the course of the war years and the years immediately following. The pattern was there, documented in letters and diaries and account books spread across the county's paper record, waiting for someone to read them all at once and recognize what they were describing. A woman named Dovie Napier, who lived half a mile downstream and occasionally came to the Cornett place to trade garden vegetables for milk and to visit with Margaret in the way that neighboring women visited in isolated mountain communities. Practically, purposefully, or with news and conversation that served as the main conduit of information across the hollow. Mentioned in a letter to her daughter that she had twice arrived at the farm in the very early morning and found signs that the fire had been burning through the night. A quantity of ash that did not match a fire lit at dawn. A hearthstone still warm to the touch in a way that suggested hours of sustained heat rather than the modest morning blaze she could see at the time of her arrival. More tellingly, a layer of wood smoke smell in the main room that clung to the curtains and the rough-hewn furniture with a persistence that spoke of hours of burning, not minutes. Dovie Napier had not asked Margaret Cornett about this. She had noticed it, cataloged it in the private ledger that women of her time and place maintained in their minds for information that might someday matter, and said nothing. I did not think it was my place to ask. She wrote to her daughter in a letter that the daughter apparently kept and that eventually found its way into the county historical records. And Margaret did not offer, and we went on talking about the garden and about Ruth's cough, which had been worrying her all month. A traveling Methodist preacher named Orville Tate recorded in his circuit diary, under an entry dated March of 1865, that he had spent a night at the Cornett farmhouse during a cold snap and had been disturbed from his sleep by sounds he could not identify. Not the ordinary settling of a log house in cold air, not the sounds of animals shifting in the barn or the creak of a loft ladder, but something he described with apparent discomfort as a kind of rhythmic dragging, persistent, below the level of the floor. It had lasted, he estimated, the better part of an hour, and had then stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a silence that somehow felt different from the silence that had preceded the sounds. Denser, more deliberate. He had said nothing about it to his hosts in the morning, he wrote, because he could not be certain it had not been a dream, and because the Cornetts were generous people who had given him supper and a warm place to sleep at no charge. And he did not wish to seem ungrateful by implying that something in their house had disturbed his rest. But he had written it down. That was the thing about Orville Tate. He was a man who wrote things down, and the writing down meant they survived. The last documented wartime observation came from a source that might seem unlikely. A Confederate irregular named Wade Sizemore, who was captured near Clover Fork in the summer of 1864, and who, during the subsequent interrogation by Home Guard officers, made a reference to the Cornett farm that the interrogating officer noted but did not follow up on. Sizemore had been moving through the county collecting intelligence about Union sympathizers and their activities, and in the course of that work, he had developed a conviction that the farm on Poor Fork was being used for something beyond ordinary farming. He could not specify what. He had observed lights moving at odd hours. He had on one occasion heard voices, low, brief, and quickly hushed, from within the farmhouse at a time when he had counted the household members visible through the window and found the count too low to account for everyone who must be inside. But he had no evidence of a specific offense. And the Home Guard officers were more interested in his military activities than in his suspicions about a farm in a hollow. And the reference was noted, and the conversation moved on. The war ended, The silence that follows large-scale violence is never as quiet as it sounds from a distance. In Harlan County, the years after Appomattox were marked by the kinds of violence that official histories tend to categorize as lawlessness, but that the people who lived through it understood as the continuation of wartime grievances by other means. Old scores were settled, old alliances frayed. Men who had fought on different sides found themselves neighbors again, and the adjustment was not always peaceful. There were shootings, there were burnings, there were men who disappeared into the mountains and were never looked for very hard because everyone understood, on some level, why they had gone. It was in this atmosphere, charged, suspicious, memories long and grudges longer, that the Cornett farmhouse passed through its most consequential period. And it was in this period that a man named Clarence Duff entered the story. Clarence Duff was not from Harlan County. He had come down from Pike County sometime in the early 1870s, drawn by the prospect of work and, some said, by the particular anonymity that a man can find in a community where he has no history. He was somewhere in his mid-30s when he arrived, a wiry and a watchful man with calloused hands and eyes that people described as the kind that measured things. He had a trade. He was a stonemason and a competent carpenter, which made him immediately useful in a county that had been neglected during the war years and was working through a backlog of repairs that peacetime had not yet resolved. He rented a room from a widow named Sally Gentry in the settlement at Clover Fork, kept to himself in the way that strangers keep to themselves when they are trying to establish a reputation for reliability rather than sociability, and found work quickly. His manner was not unfriendly. People who dealt with him on work matters found him capable and honest. He gave you what he said he would give you in the time he said it would take, and he did not pad his accounts. But there was something about him that prevented easy intimacy, a quality of held-backness that some people found merely reserved and others found evasive, depending on their disposition and their particular antenna for the distance that some men carry. He attended church irregularly. He did not drink, which in the 1870s was unusual enough to be noted. He had no visible connections to anyone in the county before his arrival, and in the years he spent there, he formed no close friendships that anyone could identify. His connection to the Cornett farm began in the spring of 1873, when Absalom Cornett, by then a man in his mid-60s, slowing down noticeably, increasingly dependent on hired labor for the heavier work, contracted with Duff to repair the farmhouse's stone foundation on the eastern wall, marks which had settled unevenly over 30 years and was beginning to pull away from the main structure in a way that would eventually threaten the integrity of the wall above it. The work was expected to take 2 weeks. It took 6. Duff's extended presence at the farm was explained at the time by the extent of the damage, which turned out to be greater than the initial inspection had suggested, and by several days of steady rain that made certain tasks impossible. Neither explanation was false, but neither explanation was complete. What was not explained, and what became a subject of considerable retrospective interest after subsequent events, now was why Absalom Cornett paid Clarence Duff not purely in cash, the usual arrangement for contract labor, but in a combination of currency and something that appeared in no invoice and left no clear paper trail. Duff's own account ledger, recovered much later from among his effects after his death, contains an entry for the Cornett job that includes a notation written in different ink and a slightly different hand from the surrounding entries, as though it had been added after the original bookkeeping was complete. The notation reads, "Consideration received," followed by an amount and the abbreviation AGR, which may have stood for agreement, or may have referred to something more specific that the abbreviation was designed to obscure: the extended presence at the farm, the unusual payment arrangement, and the notation that seemed designed to record something without describing it, These details would have meant nothing in isolation. Men were paid in unusual ways for unusual work all the time, in a county where cash was not always abundant and where neighbors settled debts in kind. But then there were the return visits. Between 1873 and 1879, Clarence Duff made at least 11 documented return visits to the Cornett farmhouse. Documented because people saw him on the road and remembered it. Because the road along Poor Fork carried light enough traffic that a man on horseback was an event worth noting. Because several of Duff's neighbors at the Gentry boarding house recalled him being absent for days at a stretch during this period and returning without explanation of where he had been. 11 visits over 6 years. Each one unexplained, each one followed by Duff's resumption of his ordinary life in Clover Fork as though nothing had interrupted it. Absalom Cornett, when asked by a neighbor named Elbert Souder about Duff's repeated appearances, said only that there were ongoing repairs to attend to. The farm always had something that needed fixing. This was true of every farm in the county. And Duff was a reliable man, with a good hand for stonework. The explanation was plausible. It was the kind of explanation that a man gives when he has the right answer, and also a true answer, and he has chosen to offer the true one because it will serve the same purpose. Souder accepted it at the time. He was a man who did not startle easily, Souder recalled later, giving an account of his conversations with Cornett to a county official during a legal proceeding that was only tangentially related to the Cornett family. A property dispute that brought Souder into the courthouse and gave him occasion to speak about his neighbors on Poor Fork. 30 years farming that hollow had taken the startle out of him. But when I asked him once, direct, what Duff was helping him with, there was something in his face that I had not seen there before. I cannot call it fear exactly. It was more like the look a man gets when he is carrying something heavier than he wants anyone to know, and someone has asked him a question that comes too close to the weight of it. The observation stayed in the courthouse record. It would be read by others, decades later, for you who would understand it differently than the man who transcribed it. Absalom Cornett died in February of 1879, during a winter that killed livestock across the county and left the ground too frozen to dig graves until March. His death was attributed to pneumonia, not uncommon among older men in the mountains in a hard winter, when the cold settled into lungs already weakened by decades of work in damp, drafty conditions and refused to leave. His death was not considered suspicious at the time, and there is no surviving evidence that it was anything other than what it appeared to be. He was buried in the family plot on the hillside above the farm in early March, when the ground had thawed enough to receive him, in a service attended by perhaps 30 neighbors and the minister from Clover Fork. Margaret outlived him by 7 years, remaining at the farm with Hiram, who had never left home and who managed the agricultural work while his mother continued to manage what she had always managed. The household, the relationships, the invisible infrastructure of trust and obligation that held the family's particular position in the community together. When Margaret died in 1886, the farm passed to Hiram, who was by then in his early 40s, a taciturn man who had spent most of his adult life working the same land his father had cleared, and who seemed, to those who knew him, to approach the inheritance with something more complicated than simple grief. Something that looked, to the more perceptive of his neighbors, like the expression of a man who has accepted a burden that he did not fully choose and does not know. Yet, on whether he will be strong enough to carry it the way it needs to be carried. It was Hiram Cornett who hired Elias Pruitt and his crew in the winter of 1887. And it was Hiram Cornett who gave Pruitt what appeared to be a straightforward assignment: repair and repoint the farmhouse's main fireplace. which had developed cracks in its mortar after 2 hard freezes in succession. The kind of cracking that spreads from season to season if it is not addressed, and that will eventually compromise the entire structure. And then left the property entirely for 3 days without leaving a forwarding address, which was unusual. Hiram Cornett had rarely spent a night away from that farm in his adult life. His neighbors noticed his absence. They assumed it was a family matter of some kind and did not press. When Pruitt's crew began removing the damaged stones from the fireplace's back wall, they expected to find rubble, infill, and clay beneath. The standard construction of the period, practical and uninteresting. What they found instead, behind a section of wall that was demonstrably newer than the surrounding stonework, was the opening to a passage. And everything that followed, the refusal, the statement, the mislaid folder, the decades of disconnected observation, everything began from that moment. The passage, as Pruitt described it in his county clerk's statement, was approximately 30 inches wide and perhaps 5 feet tall at its entrance. Generous enough for a grown person to enter while crouching and moving sideways, but not built for comfort. The stones lining its walls were fitted without mortar, dry stacked in the manner used for cellars and root pits throughout the region, but with a precision that suggested they had been placed by someone who understood what they were doing. Not rough fieldstone thrown together in a hurry, not the utilitarian roughness of a cellar wall built to hold dirt back, and nothing more. But courses laid with care, with the larger stones at the base and the smaller ones above. The way a skilled mason constructs a wall intended to last for generations. The floor of the passage was compacted earth, tamped flat and smooth in a way that required effort. The kind of effort you invest in a floor you expect to be used repeatedly. The ceiling, where Pruitt could make it out in the lamplight, was not stone but timber. Heavy beams set close together and then packed above with a mixture of clay and small stones that would have supported the weight of the floor above without creating the hollow sound that might give away the passage's existence to anyone walking through the room. Someone had thought carefully about every aspect of this construction. Nothing had been left to chance. The passage descended at an angle, Pruitt noted, as though it had been designed to pass beneath the frost line, beneath the level where winter temperatures could cause the ground to shift and heave, where a poorly built underground space would crack and shift and eventually collapse. He estimated the angle at roughly 15 degrees from horizontal, though he acknowledged he had not descended far enough to be certain. The passage continued into the darkness beyond the reach of the lantern they had brought, swallowing the light at a distance of perhaps 30 feet and offering nothing back but a faint current of cool air that one of his men described, in words that Pruitt recorded in his statement, as the same air you get when you open a cellar that has been shut up for a long time, close and cold and carrying the smell of earth and stone. It was at roughly 10 feet in that they had found the marks on the left wall. Pruitt's statement described them as vertical scratches cut into the stone face with a tool, not scratched hastily with a nail or a blade, but carved with deliberate pressure in the manner of someone who intended the marks to be permanent. When they were grouped in sets of 5 in the traditional tally fashion, 4 vertical lines and a diagonal cross-stroke to make the 5th, the same system used by anyone keeping account over time, repeated at intervals of roughly 18 inches along the wall. Pruitt counted from his position near the entrance and with the lantern held forward, at least 7 complete sets before the darkness made further counting impossible. 35 marks minimum, possibly more, probably more. Given the depth of the passage and the deliberateness with which everything else had been constructed. He and his men stood at the entrance to the passage and looked at it and said nothing for a while. Later, Pruitt would describe this moment to several people as the point at which he made a decision. Not a conscious, articulated decision, Not the kind where you weigh your options and choose. More like the kind where your body has already arrived at its conclusion before your mind has caught up. His men were not going further into the passage. He was not going further into the passage. Whatever was down there, whatever had been carved on that wall and why, was not something that Elias Pruitt and his crew were equipped to understand. And the specific quality of their not understanding it made it important that someone who might understand it be told. Which is why he filed the statement. Which is why, despite the statement being subsequently mislaid, the story of what Pruitt's crew found did not entirely disappear. It lived in the mouths of his men, in the way that things seen together are always shared more widely than things seen alone. And it traveled through the hollow and eventually to Clover Fork, and from Clover Fork to wherever the roads and the conversations carried it. Hiram Cornett returned to the farm on the third day after the discovery. He arrived in the late morning, on horseback, alone, and he spoke with Pruitt in the farmyard, with a quietness and a steadiness that Pruitt, later, would describe as the quality he remembered most clearly about the whole episode. Not anger, not distress, not the flustered embarrassment of a man caught in something, just a kind of settled acknowledgement, as though Hiram had spent the 3 days of his absence reaching an agreement with himself about what was going to happen next, and had arrived back at the farm already at peace with it. He thanked Pruitt for stopping work, and this detail struck the foreman as strange. The thanking, as though stopping had been a courtesy offered rather than a refusal forced. He paid the crew for the days they had worked generously and dismissed them without further conversation. He asked Pruitt, before the foreman left, whether he had filed any documentation with the county. Pruitt said that he had. Hiram Cornett nodded at this, slowly, as though the answer confirmed something he had already known. He said nothing more about it. He then sealed the passage entrance himself, using new mortar and stones sourced from a pile of rubble behind the barn. Material that had been sitting there long enough to be weathered, long enough that it would not look conspicuously new if you were not looking for it. The work took him most of an afternoon, and a neighboring boy who had come to the farm on an errand from his mother stood at the yard fence for the better part of an hour and watched him do it. With the frank curiosity of an 11-year-old boy who does not yet understand that there are things being witnessed that will not become comprehensible for 60 years. That boy was named Monroe Begley. He would work the coal mines when they came to the county, work them for most of his adult life, carry the image of Hiram Cornett sealing that fireplace wall through all of it. And when he finally gave an account of what he had seen to a local historian in the late 1930s, he described Hiram's manner with a precision that suggested the image had never faded. He worked the way a man works when he is not thinking about the work, Begley said. The hands know what to do, and the mind is somewhere else. He mixed the mortar, and he laid the stones, and he pressed them into place, and he never once stepped back to look at what he was doing, the way a craftsman would. He already knew what it looked like. He was doing something that didn't need looking at. He was finishing something. And then Begley said the thing that would stay with Horace Cavender for years. The question I always wondered about, but never asked because there was no one left to ask, was whether he sealed it because he wanted to forget, or because he already knew there was nothing left inside that needed tending. Nothing left inside that needed tending. The phrase carried weight in a way that Begley may not have fully intended, because to say that nothing needed tending was to imply that something had needed tending before. That the passage had not simply been a construction, an artifact, a piece of hidden architecture. That it had been an active thing, a living thing in a sense, something that required maintenance and attention and care over time, something that people had used and returned to and used again. What had been done in that passage? What had been counted on that wall? The answers were not going to come easily, and they were not going to come from the passage itself. Hiram had seen to that. They were going to have to come from somewhere else, from paper, from memory, from the particular willingness to sit with partial information long enough for the parts to arrange themselves into something coherent. They began to come, slowly, Nico, from a physician named Dr. Samuel Reardon. Dr. Samuel Reardon arrived in Harlan County in 1891, 4 years after Pruitt's discovery. He had been hired by a mining company, one of the several organizations then beginning the process of consolidating land and mineral rights in preparation for large-scale coal extraction, to conduct a survey of general health conditions in several Harlan County communities. The coal operators had learned, from experience in other mining regions, that the health of the local population had direct implications for their ability to recruit and retain a labor force. And they wanted to know what they were working with before they committed resources. Dr. Reardon was thorough, methodical, and possessed of the particular gift that distinguishes good physicians from merely competent ones. The ability to listen to what people tell him and hear, beneath the words, what they are not quite saying. He had a manner that people described as non-threatening, not warm exactly, not the bedside warmth that some physicians deploy as a professional tool, but a quality of genuine attention that made people feel that what they said mattered to him, would be remembered, would be handled with respect. In a community where outsiders were viewed with deep suspicion, this was not a small thing. In the course of his survey, Dr. Reardon interviewed dozens of residents across the county, recording their accounts of past illnesses, injuries, and deaths in their communities with a systematic completeness that most rural counties had never previously attempted. He asked about epidemics, about infant mortality, about the kinds of chronic conditions that mountain life produced in people who worked outdoors in all weather for decades. He asked about diet and water, and the particular diseases that followed mining operations when they came to a region. He was building a picture, and he needed data. It was in this capacity that he first encountered, in a conversation with an elderly woman named Priscilla Bolin, a piece of the Cornett story that had never been committed to official record. Priscilla Bolin was in her late 60s when Dr. Reardon visited her, which put her birth date in the 1820s. Old enough to have adult memories of the antebellum period, old enough to have lived through the war as a woman who understood what she was watching. She had been born in the county, had lived her entire life within 5 miles of the Poor Fork, had known every family along the creek bottom for 60 years. When she decided to tell Dr. Reardon what she knew, she did not approach the subject indirectly or frame it as a memory or a rumor. She told him she had something to say that she had not said in many years, and she said it. During the war period and in the years before it, she told him. The Cornett farm had been known among a certain group of people. She was careful about how she described this group, using the phrase, people who had reason to move carefully, with a deliberateness that Dr. Reardon noted in his transcription, as a place where assistance could be obtained. She did not initially specify the nature of the assistance. She said that she had known of at least 3 individuals who had come to the Cornett farm under specific circumstances and had not been seen again in the county afterward. She said that in some cases, this was the intended outcome, and that the families of those individuals understood this and were grateful for it. In other cases, she was less certain of the outcome, and that uncertainty had stayed with her across the decades since. Dr. Reardon asked her directly, "What kind of assistance?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that during the 1850s and into the war years, a person could sometimes need to move through the Kentucky mountains in ways that the law would not permit and that the wrong neighbors would not tolerate. that the Cornet Farm was a place where such movement was made possible for a period of years by people who had decided that certain things mattered more than the legal arrangements of the time. That she had known this, and had kept it, and had been keeping it for 30 years. Dr. Reardon recorded this account in his survey notes. He was careful and precise in his transcription, preserving her exact words where he could and paraphrasing closely where he could not. He did not, at that point, connect it to any specific physical feature of the Cornet Farm. He had not heard of Elias Pruitt's discovery 4 years earlier. He noted the account as an example of the wartime social networks that had existed throughout eastern Kentucky, networks that had moved information, goods, and people under difficult and dangerous conditions, and added a brief editorial observation that the isolation of the mountain hollows had made such networks simultaneously more necessary and more sustainable than they might have been in more accessible terrain. He filed the survey with the mining company. The survey was filed in the company's records. The records were never returned to the county, but Dr. Reardon had kept his own copy of the notes. The second major piece of the puzzle came from Clarence Duff himself, or rather, from what remained of his papers when he died in 1894, alone in a boarding house in Pineville. Duff had never married, never acquired property of any significance. He had spent his final years in declining health, working occasional masonry jobs that were increasingly beyond his physical capacity, while accepting charity with the particular quiet dignity of a man who has spent a lifetime being self-sufficient and finds dependence a more difficult adjustment than illness. He died without family, without friends in any conventional sense, without anyone to sort through his belongings and decide what mattered. His papers, the account ledger, a small bundle of letters, and a notebook that appeared to be a kind of personal journal, were claimed by no one, and eventually passed into the possession of a schoolteacher named Horace Cavender, who had been friendly with Duff in the last years of his life, in the way that a careful, curious man sometimes befriends an aging solitary, drawn by the sense that there is something worth knowing beneath the surface that will never be offered voluntarily. Cavender had recognized, even before Duff's death, and that the older man was carrying something. He had not known what it was. When the papers came to him, he began to find out. The account ledger was, on its surface, a straightforward business record. Dates, amounts, names of clients, brief descriptions of work performed. It covered a period of roughly 30 years, from shortly after Duff's arrival in Pike County through the last years of his working life. It was the kind of document that a careful, methodical man produces over a lifetime, and that contains, if you read it closely enough, the shape of an entire existence in its entries and its omissions. Cavender read it closely. He read it over and over, across many evenings in the small house he occupied near the Clover Fork School, with a lamp tilted to illuminate the handwriting and the margins. And what he eventually found was not in the entries themselves, but in the pattern of the entries and the spaces between them. The pattern of Clarence Duff's work life, reconstructed from the ledger, showed a man who took on jobs, completed them, and moved on. Except for the 6-year period from 1873 to 1879, during which a single client appeared in the record repeatedly, 11 times, for services that the ledger described in terms vague enough to be meaningless. 11 return visits to a single client over 6 years for work that Duff apparently could not or would not specify in his own private account book. The consideration received notation, the initials and the abbreviation that might have meant agreement or might have meant something else. It was not evidence of anything specific. It was a shape in the data, a pattern that did not match the surrounding patterns, and Horace Cavender had been a schoolteacher long enough to know that when a pattern breaks, the break is often the thing worth studying. The notebook was harder to read. Duff's handwriting, always cramped and inconsistent, deteriorated significantly in the later years of his life, and entire pages were nearly illegible without strong light and considerable patience. But Cavender had patience. It was, perhaps, his defining quality as both a teacher and as what he was slowly becoming, which was an investigator of sorts, a private historian, a man who had stumbled into a mystery that did not have a name yet. What he eventually found in the notebook, across months of careful reading, was a series of dated entries corresponding almost exactly to the 11 return visits in the ledger. When the entries were brief, written in a kind of compressed notation that seemed designed for Duff's own use, rather than for any reader who might come after him. They contained directions, geographic directions, specific to local landmarks that Cavender recognized, and time estimates, and what appeared to be the number of stops on a route, expressed as numerals without further explanation. And in several entries, a notation that appeared to be a count. Numbers, written at the end of the entry in a different ink, sometimes with a plus sign followed by a smaller number, as though adding something to a running total. Cavender reconstructed the running total as best he could from the entries where the numbers were legible. The total, at the end of the last entry he could date, was somewhere in the high 80s or low 90s. He could not be certain. The handwriting was bad and the ink was faded. But the implication of a running total, a number being maintained, added to across visits, tracking something that accumulated over time, was clear enough. And then there was the notation in the last legible entry, from sometime in 1878 or possibly early 1879, written not in Duff's usual cramped hand, but in a version of it that was somehow both smaller and more careful, as though the writer had taken unusual care with what he was writing. The notation read only, "The end wall, M.C. Hermark, let it stand. M.C. Margaret Cornett, her mark, let it stand." Cavender sat with this for a long time before he began to understand what it meant. Just when he thought the picture was complete. Just when the ledger and the notebook and Dr. Reardon's survey notes and Priscilla Boland's account had assembled themselves into something coherent, he encountered a document that forced him to revise almost everything. A letter, misfiled among county tax records from the late 1870s, written in the careful, precise cursive of a woman who had learned to write in an era when female literacy was not universal and was therefore something she had worked for. Written in October of 1877, addressed to a person identified only by initials, 2 initials, first and last name, that Cavender spent weeks trying to match to any name in the county's records without success. Postmarked from a town in Ohio that Cavender recognized as sitting on the northern bank of the Ohio River and directly across from the Kentucky shore. The letter made clear something that overturned Cavender's chronology entirely. The passage had not been built in 1873, as Duff's notebook implied. Duff had extended something that already existed. The original construction was older, significantly older, and the marks on the wall, the tally marks that Elias Pruitt had assumed were a laborer's rough record, had not begun during the Reconstruction era, but during the war itself. No, earlier than that. The count that we began in the old cellar, Margaret Cornett wrote, in the measured prose of a woman choosing every word with care, was moved to the lower passage when the lower passage was made, and continues there now, kept in the same fashion by the same hand as it was from the beginning. There are those who would call such keeping a vanity. I call it what it is, the only monument that was possible, and the only one that was wanted. The only monument that was possible, and the only one that was wanted. Cavender read the sentence 3 times before he reached for his pen. The woman who could explain it was named Hattie Farler. She was in her late 80s when Cavender found her, or rather when she found him. Having heard through the communication network of an isolated mountain community that someone was asking questions about the Cornet place, about the passage and the marks and Clarence Duff's return visits. She sent word through an intermediary that she would speak with him. He rode 12 miles through a December cold that turned his breath to vapor in front of his face and made the road slick in the shaded sections where the sun had not reached since autumn. She lived at the head of a creek called Martin's Fork, in a small house that had the settled, organic quality of a building that has never been separated from the person who occupies it. The house smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular mineral smell of stone walls in cold weather. She was seated close to the fire when he arrived, wrapped in a quilt, with the stillness of a very old person who has learned to conserve energy the way a fire conserves itself in a low burn. Contained, steady, nothing wasted. She did not ask him what he knew. She asked him what he thought he knew. And then she listened to his account with an expression that shifted once, slightly, when he mentioned the count in Duff's notebook, and then settled back into a composure that he read as the expression of a woman who has been deciding, for many years, whether to have this conversation, and has finally decided. "You have most of it," she said. "Not all of it. The part you are missing is the beginning." The beginning, she told him, was not Clarence Duff, and it was not 1873, and it was not even the Civil War. The beginning was Margaret Cornet, and it was the late 1840s, and it was a decision that Margaret had made before the farmhouse on Poor Fork was more than a few years old. Margaret Bray had grown up in Letcher County in a family that straddled the particular moral geography of eastern Kentucky in the antebellum period. Not slaveholders themselves, not poor enough to be entirely outside the slave economy, but connected by geography and trade to both the institution and to the complex of people who opposed it. She had grown up knowing that certain things were done, whereas she had grown up knowing that certain people moved through the mountains in ways that required assistance, and that the assistance was given by those who were willing to give it at personal risk and without public acknowledgement. When she married Absalom Cornet and moved to the Poor Fork farm in the early 1840s, she arrived with an understanding of what the farm's location made possible, and a very clear intention about what she was going to do with that possibility. Absalom was not, she later told Hattie, unwilling. But he was not the originator. The operation, and it is appropriate to use that word, because it had the organization and the sustained deliberateness of an operation rather than an impulse, was Margaret's conception, Margaret's planning, and Margaret's maintenance across the years that followed, and the root cellar behind the kitchen had been the first hiding place. It was already there when they arrived. Standard construction, unremarkable. Margaret had assessed it within the first season on the farm and had seen in it what a person with her particular state of mind sees in such spaces. Not storage, but possibility. Not a cellar, but a room with a door that locked from the outside and a depth that held steady at 52 degrees year-round, and a location at the back of the hill that was not visible from the road. The first person had come through in the summer of 1849. Hattie did not know the details of this. Margaret had told her only that it had happened, that it had been arranged through the network she had established contact with before ever moving to Poor Fork. A network that stretched north toward Ohio and south toward Tennessee, and that operated, as such networks must operate, on absolute trust in the people it used and absolute silence toward the people it did not. The root cellar had been used, and the person had passed through and continued north. And when they were gone, Margaret had taken a nail and made a mark in the cellar wall. Not from any dramatic impulse, not from sentimentality, from the same practical cast of mind that made her note everything that mattered and record it in whatever way was available. The mark was a record, The person had been here. The person had passed through. 1. Over the next decade and a half, the marks accumulated, not rapidly. This was not an operation that moved hundreds of people a season. It was careful, irregular, organized around the specific circumstances of the individuals involved and the current danger level on the various routes. Some years there were many marks. Some years there were none. The count that accumulated was, in Margaret's own words in the letter Cavender had found, a monument. The only kind available to a woman operating in total secrecy, acknowledging the passage of people whose names could not be written, whose movement could not be documented, whose survival depended on the absence of any record that would connect them to this place. When Clarence Duff came to the farm in 1873, he came for a specific purpose: to build the passage. The root cellar had become insufficient. The war had changed the county in ways that made the old arrangements precarious. Reconstruction had not ended the danger. In some ways, it had intensified it, because the legal status of people who had been enslaved was now being contested in new ways, through new legal mechanisms, by people with resources and institutional support. The network had continued operating after the war because the need had continued after the war, and the need required better infrastructure. Duff had been recruited through the same network. His history before Pike County was not something he had ever shared in Harlan County, and it was not something that Hattie Farler could speak to in detail. But his willingness to come, to do the work quietly, to accept payment in a form that was partly money and partly the kind of silent understanding that people in such networks exchange when money is insufficient. This she knew. He had built the passage, and he had built it well, and he had come back 11 times across 6 years to maintain it and to serve, when needed, as a guide along the routes that the passage connected to. The last time anyone used it, Hattie said, was in the early 1880s. Margaret was still alive. She counted them in herself. She said afterward that she counted because she wanted the number to be exact. She did not want to approximate what had been done. She wanted the record to be accurate. Cavender asked the question he had been building toward for years. How many marks are there? At the end of the passage, in the section that Pruitt's lantern didn't reach? Hattie Farler was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted, settling lower, and the shadows in the room rearranged themselves around the new shape of the light. I was inside it once, she said. Margaret took me in the late 1870s. She wanted someone else to have seen it. She wanted a witness. I counted. She told him. 112 complete tally marks, 22 complete groups of 5, and 2 additional marks that had not yet reached the 5th. The count, in other words, was still open when the passage was sealed, still waiting for a cross-stroke that would never come, because the passage was closed before it arrived. 112 people. Cavender sat very still. Non storm. 112 people who had moved through the root cellar and then through the passage of the Cornet farmhouse on Poor Fork between the late 1840s and the early 1880s, in circumstances that required concealment and whose continued existence required that they not be remembered in any way that connected them to this particular hollow in Harlan County, Kentucky. Why did they seal it? He asked. Why did Margaret finally seal it? She didn't, Hattie said. That was Hiram. After she died, he decided the risk had passed. Or maybe he decided he couldn't carry it the way she had. I don't know which. Maybe both. He sealed it, and then he hired the mason. And then he left for 3 days because he couldn't watch someone break open what his mother had built, even if the breaking open wasn't that. And the name, Cavender said. Then Duff's notebook had mentioned a name, carved at the end of the passage. a mark different from the others. Hattie looked at him for a long moment. Then she described it. A woman's name, first name only, cut in careful letters half an inch tall at the very end of the passage wall, where the passage terminated at a stone face. A name that Cavender recognized, when he heard it, as belonging to no one he had ever found in any county record connected to the Cornett family. A name that stood there at the end of the count, not as a number, but as a person. The person for whom the count had been kept. The person who had been the reason for the first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849. The first one through. The one who had made the operation possible by demonstrating that it was possible. The one whose passage had convinced Margaret Cornett that what she was doing was worth doing. That the risk and the silence and the weight of the secret were worth what they produced at the other end of that cold, narrow underground corridor. Cavender did not ask Hattie to repeat the name. He had heard it clearly the first time. And as he prepared to leave, mounting his horse in the December cold with his notes inside his coat where the wind could not reach them, he made a decision that he would maintain for the rest of his life. The name would not go into his record. It had stayed private for 60 years because the people who knew it had decided it should be private. He was not in a position to override that decision. Some things belong to the people who made them, and the archivist's job is not always to surface everything. No, sometimes it is to understand what was buried and why, and to let the why stand. Horace Cavender never published anything about the Cornett farmhouse. The notes survived because he gave them, on his death in the early 1920s, to a nephew with a brief written instruction. These belong in an institution that will handle them carefully, and I leave it to you to find one. The nephew, a practical man who did not share his uncle's antiquarian inclinations but respected them, took the instructions seriously. The notes passed through several custodians over the following years and eventually came to rest in a small local archive in Harlan County sometime in the mid-20th century, cataloged under a heading that did not mention the Cornett family by name. By then, the farmhouse itself was gone. The coal industry had come to Poor Fork and had reshaped the landscape so completely that the ground where the farmhouse had stood was unrecognizable. Regraded, reroaded, incorporated into the infrastructure of extraction that had been the county's economic future since before anyone living there had been born. The passage was gone. The root cellar was gone. The fireplace, the stone walls, the compacted earth floor of the corridor, the timber ceiling beams, the marks, all of it was gone. What remained was paper. Elias Pruitt's statement to the county clerk, eventually recovered from the county records, not mislaid in any malicious sense, but buried in a collection of 1880s documents, bundled together under a label too vague to be useful. Found by a researcher who was looking for something else entirely, and recognized in the brief, precise language of Pruitt's account the quality of a man who had understood, even in the moment of the discovery, that he was documenting something that mattered. Dr. Reardon's survey notes, or at least the copy he had kept for himself, which eventually made their way into a state archive in Frankfurt, where they were cataloged as a public health document and almost never consulted. Priscilla Boland's account, existing only in Reardon's transcription, her actual voice long gone. Duff's account ledger and notebook, the handwriting faded to near illegibility in many sections, preserved almost entirely by Cavender's careful transcription of the most important passages. And Cavender's own notes. The reconstruction, the reasoning, the months of patient connection-making that had assembled the individual pieces into something approaching a complete picture. The letter in Margaret Cornett's hand from October of 1877, the one that had been misfiled among tax records and that had rewritten Cavender's chronology. That letter cannot now be located. Whether it was removed deliberately, whether it was lost in one of the moves the archive collection underwent over the decades, whether it was destroyed, no one knows. Cavender's transcription of the key passages from it is the only evidence that it existed. Hiram Cornett died in 1903, the last of Absalom and Margaret's children to survive. He had never married. He had farmed the poor fork land until the mining companies began buying up the mineral rights in the county. And then he had sold, and then he had moved to a town further up the county and lived out his final years in a boarding house, not entirely unlike the one where Clarence Duff had died 9 years earlier. He left no papers. If he kept a journal or wrote letters that contained anything about what he knew, those documents have not been found. He was buried in the same hillside plot as his parents, in the years before the coal operations reached that section of the hollow, and changed everything around the graves without disturbing the graves themselves. The count was 112, as Hattie Farler had told Cavender. 112 people who passed through the root cellar and then through the passage, across more than 30 years, in circumstances that required absolute concealment. 112 marks on a wall that no longer exists. The 112 people whose destinations were not recorded, whose subsequent lives cannot be traced to this particular hollow, who entered the passage carrying whatever they carried and emerged, somewhere on the other side of the Kentucky mountains, into whatever came next. Whether they found what they were looking for is not a question that the Cornett farmhouse's history can answer. The marks recorded their passage, not their destination or their fate. Each mark said only, someone was here, someone passed through, someone was counted. The silence that surrounded the operation, the deliberate, sustained, multi-generational silence of everyone who knew, was not, as has sometimes been assumed about such silences, a silence born of shame. It was the silence of protection. Protection for the people who had been moved through the passage, some of whom might still have been in positions of vulnerability decades after the passage was sealed. Protection for the network that had made it possible, for the people at other points along the routes who had taken the same risks and made the same choices and were owed the same discretion. Protection for the operation itself against the retrospective judgment of a post-war society that was still, in many of its legal and social arrangements, working out what it actually believed about what had been done and who had the right to do it. Margaret Cornett had chosen the record over the recognition. She had understood, or perhaps from the very beginning, from the moment she put the first mark on the root cellar wall in the summer of 1849, that the recognition was not possible and was not the point. The marks were not for posterity. They were not for history. They were for the count itself, for the accuracy of the count, for the fact of 112 being exactly 112 and not an approximation. They were, as she had written in the letter, that Cavender found and that no one can now find, the only monument that was possible and the only one that was wanted. And then there is the name at the end of the wall, the name that Horace Cavender heard from Hattie Farler on a December afternoon at the head of Martin's Fork, and that he chose not to record, and that died with both of them. It is possible that someone, somewhere, Indich knows that name. It is possible that among the descendants of the 112, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who passed through the Cornett Passage and continued north, who built lives in Ohio and Indiana and points further, who carried with them the memory or the story or simply the fact of their survival. It is possible that someone knows where it began, knows the name of the farm on Poor Fork, has heard in some form the account of the fireplace and the passage and the woman who counted. It is also possible that they do not, and that the connection between that first mark in 1849 and everything that followed it was severed precisely as intended. Completely, cleanly, with nothing trailing behind to endanger anyone. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything about the Cornett farmhouse has been uncovered? Or do you think there are layers that still haven't come to light? Do you think Margaret Cornett made the right choice, giving up recognition for safety? Leave your comment below. These are the conversations that history deserves and almost never gets. If this story stayed with you, if you want more dark chapters of American history told this way, without the comfort of easy answers, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who understands that the most disturbing stories are the ones that could have actually happened, and that very often did. We'll see you in the next one.
Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you, I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again. Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy. With a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you.